Listen carefully. There is a moment when a man finally understands something most never do. No one is coming to save him, not his friends, not society, not fate. And when that illusion dies, something far more powerful replaces it. Self-respect that no longer needs permission, validation, or approval. This is not the moment you break. This is the moment you become untouchable. You were taught to look outward for confirmation, to measure your worth by reactions, attention, praise, agreement. But Machiavelli warned us, long before modern psychology put softer words to it, any man who depends on others to feel whole is already compromised. Dependency is not connection. It is leverage handed to the wrong people. Here is the truth most men avoid. Self-love does not start with warmth. It starts with distance, with withdrawal, with the ability to step back and say, "You no longer get access to my inner world." The moment you stop chasing validation is the moment your presence becomes heavier, scarcer, more respected. You don't build unbreakable self-love by repeating affirmations in the mirror. You build it by revoking permissions. Permission to disrespect you, permission to drain you, permission to decide your value. When you take that power back silently, everything shifts. People feel it before they understand it. This is the exact moment where the old version of you dissolves, the version that needed to be liked, explained, chosen. From here on, your worth is no longer open for discussion. It simply exists. If this realization hit you, lock it in. Comment this phrase right now. My worth is no longer debated. This is psychrism, where self-love is not soft, not loud, not performative. It is cold, controlled, unbreakable. Number 1. The illusion of being chosen. Here is where most men get trapped and they don't even realize it. They believe self-love comes from being chosen. Chosen by a woman, chosen by friends, chosen by society, chosen by opportunity. They wait for a signal that says, "Now you matter," and while they wait, they rot. Machiavellian philosophy exposes this lie with brutal clarity. The man who waits to be chosen has already declared himself inferior. Power does not ask for selection. Power selects itself. The moment you internalize this, something dangerous awakens inside you, an independence that makes you uncontrollable. You are conditioned to chase approval because approval feels like safety. When people accept you, your nervous system relaxes. When they reject you, it panics. Dark psychology explains this simply. Humans are wired to avoid social exile. But here is the part no one tells you, that wiring is exploitable. Anyone who knows you crave acceptance can manipulate you with silence, attention, praise, or withdrawal. And that is why self-love built on approval will always be fragile. Think about it. If your confidence rises when they praise you and collapses when they ignore you, then your self-love is not yours. It belongs to whoever is watching. That is not confidence. That is dependency with better branding. Unbreakable self-love begins the moment you see this clearly and feel disgust instead of fear. Stoic men understood this long before modern psychology tried to soften it. They trained themselves to remove emotional leverage from the external world, not because they hated people, but because they respected themselves too much to be governed by moods, reactions, or opinions. This is where the separation happens. You stop asking, "Do they like me?" You start asking, "Do they deserve access to me?" That single inversion changes everything. Your attention becomes selective, your energy becomes guarded, your silence becomes heavier than your words, and people feel it immediately. Here's the dark truth. When you stop trying to be chosen, people suddenly try to choose you, not because you changed your tactics, but because you removed your need. Need is loud. Detachment is intimidating. This is why Machiavellian power is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't explain. It simply exists, and others adjust around it. Self-love at this level is not emotional warmth. It's structural integrity. It means your sense of worth no longer bends to external pressure. Praise becomes noise. Criticism becomes data. Rejection becomes irrelevant. And yes, this makes people uncomfortable because a man who does not need validation cannot be controlled by it. Ask yourself honestly, how many decisions in your life were shaped by the fear of being misunderstood, disliked, or excluded? How many times did you shrink your ambition, soften your voice, or betray your instincts just to remain acceptable? That version of you was trained, not weak. But now the training ends. At this stage, self-love becomes cold in the best way. You stop performing, you stop over-explaining, you stop negotiating your boundaries, not aggressively, not emotionally, simply, finally. This is where dark psychology flips in your favor. When you are no longer desperate to be included, your presence becomes optional, and optional people are respected more than available ones. Scarcity applies to psychology as much as it does to resources. This is why men who are comfortable alone are perceived as powerful, not because they reject others, but because they are not dependent on them. If you feel this shift happening inside you right now, anchor it. Comment this phrase below. I choose myself first. Let it be seen. Let it be permanent. From this point forward, self-love stops asking permission. It stops seeking proof. It stops justifying itself. It becomes something solid, something quiet, something immovable. And the world responds differently to immovable men. In Sigrhythm, we don't chase confidence. We build internal dominance. We don't beg for respect. We remove the conditions under which disrespect is possible. This is only the second layer. It gets colder from here. Number 2, the discipline of emotional ownership. There comes a phase where self-love stops being a concept and starts becoming a discipline. And this is where most men quietly fail because discipline demands consistency without applause. Emotional ownership means you no longer blame circumstances, people, timing, or luck for your internal state. You stop saying they made me feel and replace it with a harder truth. I allowed myself to react. This is not self-criticism. This is self-command. Machiavellian thinking does not waste time on comfort narratives. It asks one question only: who is in control? If your emotions spike based on another person's tone, silence, approval, or absence, then control is external, and anything external can be weaponized against you. Dark psychology teaches that emotional predictability is the first weakness predators look for, because predictable men can be steered. Stoic masculinity rejects this entirely. It does not deny emotion, it disciplines it. You feel anger without exploding. You feel desire without chasing. You feel disappointment without collapsing. This is not repression, it is mastery. When you own your emotional responses, you reclaim leverage over your behavior, and behavior is destiny. Most men never realize how often they act against their long-term interests simply to relieve short-term emotional discomfort. They speak too soon to ease anxiety. They explain themselves to reduce tension. They compromise boundaries to avoid guilt. Each of these moments feels small, but together they construct a life of quiet submission. Emotional ownership severs this pattern. You learn to sit in discomfort without flinching. You allow silence to stretch without filling it. You let misunderstanding exist without correcting it. This alone elevates you above the majority because the average man is addicted to emotional resolution. He needs things clarified, smoothed over, validated. You no longer need that relief. You can carry unresolved tension without leaking power. Machiavelli understood that those who control their reactions control negotiations, conflicts, and outcomes. The man who reacts least observes most. Observation creates options. Options create power. This is why emotional ownership feels cold to those who don't understand it. They mistake restraint for indifference, calm for weakness, silence for submission. They are wrong. Silence is often the loudest signal of internal authority. When you stop reacting automatically, you start choosing deliberately. You notice patterns instead of getting caught inside them. You see how people test boundaries subtly, through jokes, delays, passive aggression, selective attention. Before, these things would trigger you. Now, they inform you. You gather data instead of bleeding energy. This shift alone rewires how others perceive you. People become careful around men who don't offer emotional tells because uncertainty creates respect. They don't know how far they can push, so they push less. Emotional ownership also reshapes how you view yourself. You stop romanticizing suffering, you stop dramatizing setbacks, you stop narrating your pain as identity. Pain becomes information, failure becomes feedback, success becomes temporary. None of these define you anymore. You become centered rather than reactive. This is where self-love stops being about feeling good and becomes about maintaining internal order. You protect your mental environment the way a strategist protects supply lines, quietly, ruthlessly, without apology. You choose what enters your attention. You choose what earns your reaction. You choose what deserves your emotional energy. Everything else is noise. Over time, this discipline hardens into presence, not loud presence, not performative confidence, a grounded presence that does not rush, does not chase, does not explain itself. People sense that you are not easily moved, and they adjust their behavior accordingly. This is not manipulation. It is consequence. When you no longer outsource your emotional stability, you stop being an easy target for chaos. Relationships change. Conflicts shorten, provocations lose their effect. You realize how often others relied on your reactions to feel powerful. When those reactions disappear, so does their leverage. Emotional ownership also removes self-betrayal. You no longer say yes when your instincts say no. You no longer tolerate disrespect under the banner of understanding. You no longer stay silent to keep peace that costs you dignity. Peace without dignity is not peace. It is containment. Machiavellian realism understands that respect precedes harmony, not the other way around. By owning your emotional responses, you signal that you are not negotiable under pressure. You do not escalate, but you do not retreat. You remain steady. This steadiness becomes your signature. Over time, it compounds. Situations that once overwhelmed you now barely register. People who once intimidated you now seem transparent. You begin to see the emotional economy of every interaction. Who seeks approval, who seeks control, who fears silence, who fears exposure. And because you no longer fear these things yourself, you move freely among them. This is the quiet transformation most men never complete. They want confidence without discipline, strength without restraint, self-love without responsibility. But unbreakable self-love is not built on comfort. It is built on command. Command of your reactions, command of your attention, command of your inner world. When you achieve this, the external world loses its power to destabilize you. And a man who cannot be destabilized cannot be dominated. Number 3, the withdrawal of access. At a certain level of inner development, self-love evolves into something far more decisive, the deliberate withdrawal of access. This is where most men hesitate because they confuse access with morality, availability with goodness, openness with strength. But Machiavellian realism cuts through this confusion without mercy. Every human interaction is an exchange, and access is the most valuable currency you possess. Your time, your attention, your emotional availability, your tolerance, these are not infinite resources, yet most men give them away as if they are worthless. They respond instantly, explain endlessly, accommodate constantly, and then wonder why they feel depleted, overlooked, or quietly disrespected. Dark psychology reveals why this happens. What is freely given is unconsciously devalued, not out of cruelty, but out of human nature. When people know they can reach you at any moment, affect you easily, or extract emotional reactions on demand, your presence loses gravity. Self-love becomes unbreakable when you understand that access must be earned, not assumed. This does not mean hostility or isolation. It means selectivity. You stop being universally available and become intentionally present. The shift is subtle but profound. You no longer rush to respond to every message, every provocation, every emotional pull. You allow space to exist between stimulus and response. In that space, power grows. Stoic masculinity understands this instinctively. The disciplined man does not live reactively. He does not organize his internal state around the expectations or urgency of others. He moves on his own timing, guided by priorities rather than pressure. When you withdraw access, you are not punishing others. You are protecting structure. Structure is what keeps self-love intact under stress. Without it, even the strongest mindset collapses under constant intrusion. Most men sabotage themselves by overexposure. They reveal too much, too quickly, to people who have not demonstrated loyalty, competence, or alignment. They confuse vulnerability with honesty and transparency with trust. Machiavelli warned against this centuries ago. Familiarity breeds contempt, not because people are evil, but because information is power. The more predictable, readable, and accessible you are, the easier you are to influence. When you reduce access, unpredictability increases, and unpredictability commands attention. This is why silence unsettles people more than confrontation. Silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty forces others to adjust. You begin to notice how often people test access unconsciously, through late replies, subtle disrespect, emotional dumping, boundary pushing disguised as closeness. Before, you absorbed these behaviors without question. Now, you observe them. Observation replaces tolerance. You don't react emotionally. You recalibrate proximity. This is advanced self-love. You stop correcting people and start repositioning yourself. You don't argue for respect. You remove yourself from environments where respect is absent. This alone rewires your psychological posture. You stop feeling trapped because you are no longer dependent on being included. Inclusion becomes optional. Optionality is power. The man who can walk away calmly holds leverage without displaying it. Dark psychology explains that people unconsciously mirror the value you assign yourself. When you limit access, you signal scarcity. Scarcity triggers reassessment. People become more deliberate, more careful, more respectful, not because you demanded it, but because your behavior redefined the terms of engagement. This is why withdrawing access feels uncomfortable at first. You are dismantling old conditioning that equated availability with worth. The nervous system resists because it fears loss of connection, approval, relevance. But once you endure that discomfort, clarity emerges. You realize how many relationships were sustained not by mutual respect, but by your willingness to tolerate imbalance. When access is withdrawn, imbalanced relationships collapse quickly. Balanced ones stabilize. This is a filtering mechanism, not a punishment. Self-love at this level is surgical. You stop pouring energy into places where it evaporates. You redirect it inward, into discipline, skill, health, focus, long-term leverage. Your presence becomes cleaner, less cluttered, more intentional. You speak less, but with more weight. You listen more, but reveal less. People start projecting onto you, filling the gaps with assumptions. Let them. Mystery is not deception, it is restraint. Machiavellian power thrives in restraint. The man who says everything has no leverage left. The man who withholds selectively controls the flow of information, emotion, and engagement. This does not make you cold, it makes you precise. Precision is the difference between chaos and control. Over time, the withdrawal of access hardens into identity. You no longer feel obligated to entertain nonsense, justify boundaries, or absorb emotional turbulence that isn't yours. You choose where to stand, where to invest, where to remain silent. This self-selective posture changes how you experience life. Stress reduces, not because problems disappear, but because fewer problems are allowed entry into your inner world. You begin to feel internally insulated, not numb, stable. This stability is magnetic. People sense that you are not easily pulled into drama, urgency, or emotional dependency. They approach you differently. Some drift away, that is acceptable. Others step up, becoming more respectful, more intentional, more aligned. That is the cost of access. Most men never reach this stage because it requires letting go of the need to be liked. But once you release that need, self-love stops being fragile. It no longer rises and falls with social feedback. It becomes structural, rooted in standards rather than feelings. You do not need to announce this change. In fact, announcing it weakens it. True withdrawal of access is quiet. It is felt, not explained. And once you master it, you realize something crucial. The world does not decide your worth through inclusion. You decide it through boundaries. Boundaries are not walls, they are filters. And the man who controls his filters controls his life. Number 4. The recoding of identity. At a deeper level, beyond discipline and boundaries, self-love becomes something far more permanent, a recoding of identity. This is the stage where you stop trying to be strong and instead become structured around strength. Identity is the most powerful psychological force a man possesses because behavior always obeys identity, never motivation. Motivation is emotional and temporary. Identity is cold and persistent. Most men live with borrowed identities, roles handed to them by family, culture, trauma, or survival instincts. The agreeable one, the provider, the misunderstood one, the loyal one, the overlooked one. These identities were once useful, even necessary, but over time they turn into cages. Machiavellian realism demands that identity be chosen, not inherited. If you do not consciously define who you are, the world will define you in ways that benefit it, not you. Dark psychology explains why this matters. Humans instinctively interact with the identity you project, not the intentions you hold. You may intend to be respected, but if your identity is structured around pleasing, sacrificing, or explaining, respect will never stabilize. Recoding identity means dismantling the internal narrative that governs your reactions. It means recognizing that every time you say, "This is just how I am," you are reinforcing a psychological boundary that limits your future behavior. Stoic masculinity rejects this fatalism. The Stoics understood that character is not discovered, it is trained. You are not uncovering your true self. You are engineering a more effective one. This process begins quietly. You start noticing the words you use internally. Not what you say aloud, but the language running beneath your actions, the excuses, the justifications, the self-soothing lies. I didn't want to cause problems. It's not worth the conflict. That's just how people are. Each of these phrases signals an identity anchored in avoidance rather than command. Recoding identity requires interrupting these scripts without emotion. You replace them not with affirmations, but with standards. Standards are impersonal. They don't argue. They don't negotiate. They simply exist and eliminate what doesn't align. Instead of asking how you feel, you ask what aligns with your principles. Instead of asking what others expect, you ask what preserves your leverage. This shift feels mechanical at first, almost detached. That is because you are moving from emotional identity to structural identity. Emotional identity fluctuates with mood and context. Structural identity holds under pressure. Machiavelli would have recognized this immediately. A man governed by feelings is governed by circumstances. A man governed by principles governs himself. As the recoding deepens, you begin to feel a separation between impulse and action. The impulse still arises: anger, attraction, irritation, fear, but it no longer dictates behavior. This is not suppression. Suppression is chaotic and explosive. This is filtration. The impulse is evaluated against identity. Does this reaction align with who I am becoming? Does this behavior increase or reduce my leverage? Does this choice reinforce command or erode it? Over time, this filtering becomes automatic. You don't feel strong in the dramatic sense. You feel aligned. Alignment is far more dangerous than intensity. Intensity burns out. Alignment compounds. Dark psychology reveals an uncomfortable truth here. People treat you based on what you tolerate repeatedly. Identity is not declared once. It is reinforced through consistency. Each time you allow a boundary violation, you are not just being flexible, you are rewriting your identity downward. Each time you hold the line calmly, you reinforce it upward. Self-love becomes unbreakable when identity is no longer negotiable under stress. You stop bending to maintain harmony. You stop over-functioning to preserve connection. You stop absorbing chaos to keep relationships alive. This does not make you harsh. It makes you coherent. Coherence is rare, and rarity creates gravity. At this stage, your relationship with fear changes. Fear does not disappear, but it loses authority. Fear becomes a signal, not a command. You notice it, acknowledge it, and proceed anyway when alignment demands it. Most men mistake fearlessness for courage. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to let fear rewrite identity. When your identity is clear, fear has nowhere to attach itself. It cannot bargain with you. It cannot threaten you with loss of approval or comfort, because those currencies no longer govern your decisions. This is why men with strong identities appear calm in situations that destabilize others. They are not braver by nature. They are simply not internally divided. Recoding identity also dissolves resentment. Resentment exists when behavior violates identity repeatedly. You resent others when you feel forced to act against yourself. Once identity is aligned, resentment fades because you stop participating in dynamics that generate it. You no longer say yes while feeling no. You no longer tolerate while feeling disrespected. You no longer remain silent while feeling diminished. Silence, tolerance, and patience become tools, not compulsions. When you choose them, they serve you. When you don't, you withdraw without drama. This is not emotional detachment from life. It is emotional ownership applied to identity itself. You also begin to notice how many people are threatened by identity clarity, not openly, subtly, through jokes, minimization, passive resistance, or attempts to pull you back into old roles. This is not malice. It is psychological inertia. People are comfortable with the version of you they understand. When you change internally, it destabilizes their expectations. Machiavellian awareness allows you to see this without anger. You don't confront it. You don't explain it. You simply remain consistent. Consistency is the ultimate proof. Over time, resistance fades or people remove themselves. Either outcome strengthens your position. This stage is where self-love becomes quiet and non-performative. You no longer feel the need to broadcast confidence or prove growth. Your internal dialogue simplifies. There is less noise, fewer debates, fewer internal negotiations. You know what you will and will not do. This certainty reduces cognitive friction. Decisions become faster, cleaner, less emotionally taxing. Energy that was once spent on overthinking becomes available for execution. This is where discipline transforms into momentum. Stoic philosophy emphasized living in accordance with nature, but nature here is not impulse, it is reasoned design. You design yourself the way a strategist designs a system, with redundancies, fail-safes, and clear priorities. Emotional spikes no longer collapse the structure because the structure was built to withstand them. You stop identifying with temporary states. A bad day does not become a bad identity. A failure does not become a personal narrative. Everything becomes contextual rather than personal. This alone prevents psychological spirals that destroy weaker men. Eventually, you realize something unsettling and empowering. Self-love at this level is no longer about how you feel about yourself. It is about how reliably you act in alignment with your chosen identity. Feelings fluctuate. Identity does not. This is why praise no longer inflates you, and criticism no longer destabilizes you. Neither has the authority to rewrite what has already been decided internally. You become internally sovereign. And sovereignty, once established, is extremely difficult to overthrow. This is the stage most people will never see from the outside. They will sense something has changed, but they won't be able to name it. You don't look louder. You don't look colder. You look settled. And that settlement is intimidating because it cannot be rushed, flattered, or provoked easily. You are no longer becoming someone. You are maintaining something. Maintenance is the final form of power. It is quiet, disciplined, and relentless. When identity is recoded correctly, self-love stops being something you defend. It becomes something you operate from, and anything that does not align with it simply fails to gain traction in your life. That is when self-love becomes unbreakable, not because nothing tries to break it, but because nothing is allowed close enough to matter. Part 5. The Art of Being Unreachable. At this stage, self-love no longer feels like something you practice. It feels like a perimeter you maintain. You begin to understand that being unreachable is not about isolation, arrogance, or withdrawal from life. It is about control over access to your inner world. Most men are reachable by default. Their emotions are exposed, their reactions predictable, their availability constant. This makes them easy to influence, easy to drain, easy to destabilize. When you become unreachable, you remove yourself from this category entirely. You are still present, still functional, still engaged, but you are no longer emotionally accessible on demand. This distinction is critical. Presence without accessibility creates authority. Unreachability begins internally. It is the decision that not everything deserves a response, not everyone deserves clarity, and not every emotion deserves expression. You stop feeling obligated to react in real time. You allow pauses. You allow silence. You allow people to sit with their own uncertainty. This is deeply uncomfortable for those who rely on emotional feedback to orient themselves. They are used to knowing where they stand. With you, they no longer do. And uncertainty, when paired with consistency, produces respect. Dark psychology explains why this works. Humans seek patterns. When they cannot predict your emotional responses, they become cautious. They observe more closely. They test less aggressively. This is not because you intimidate them through force, but because you deny them information. Information asymmetry has always been a pillar of power. The less readable you are, the less controllable you become. Machiavellian strategy is built on this principle. Reveal less than necessary. Speak only when it serves position. Move without announcing intention. Most men sabotage this by over-communicating. They explain motives. They justify decisions. They narrate feelings. They believe transparency builds trust. In reality, premature transparency builds familiarity, and familiarity erodes leverage. Trust is built through consistency of behavior, not emotional disclosure. When you are unreachable, people learn to trust your actions rather than your words. This shifts the dynamic entirely. You are no longer evaluated on how you feel, but on how you operate. Stoic masculinity reinforces this through restraint. The Stoics did not believe in emotional suppression. They believed in emotional governance. Governance means emotions exist, but they do not rule. You experience frustration without broadcasting it. You experience desire without chasing it. You experience disappointment without advertising it. This containment creates psychological insulation. Your internal state becomes difficult to penetrate. External chaos does not immediately translate into internal disturbance. As this art develops, you notice a strange reversal. The less you seek emotional closeness, the more others attempt to draw it out of you. The less you explain yourself, the more people speculate. The less you react, the more weight your eventual responses carry. This is not manipulation, it is consequence. When access is rare, it becomes valuable. When reactions are limited, they become meaningful. Being unreachable also rewires how you deal with conflict. You stop engaging in emotional battles. You no longer argue to be understood. You no longer defend yourself against misinterpretation. Defense implies vulnerability. Silence implies self-sufficiency. When conflict arises, you assess rather than react. Is this worth engagement? Does responding improve position or dilute it? Most conflicts collapse when one party refuses to escalate emotionally. Emotional escalation requires two participants. When you withdraw yours, the structure fails. This does not mean you avoid confrontation entirely. It means confrontation becomes precise. When you do speak, it is brief, controlled, and final. You do not negotiate boundaries repeatedly. You state them once through action. If they are violated, you adjust proximity. No drama, no lectures, no emotional displays. Consequences replace conversations. This is where self-love becomes enforceable without aggression. Unreachability also changes how you relate to praise and criticism. Praise no longer inflates you because it does not define you. Criticism no longer wounds you because it does not penetrate identity. Both are external stimuli. You process them analytically, not emotionally. Praise becomes data about perception. Criticism becomes data about friction. Neither becomes a verdict on your worth. This emotional neutrality makes you difficult to manipulate. Flattery fails. Shaming fails. Provocation fails. These tactics rely on emotional hooks you no longer offer. Over time, people begin to sense that you are internally anchored. You are not easily pulled into urgency, drama, or emotional dependency. This creates a subtle hierarchy shift. People adjust their behavior around you. They become more deliberate, more respectful, more careful with words and actions, not because you demanded it, but because unpredictability combined with consistency forces recalibration. Being unreachable also demands discipline with yourself. You cannot maintain this posture if you indulge every impulse privately. Unreachability is not an aesthetic. It is an internal standard. You must be unreachable to your own self-sabotage, to impulsive reactions, to emotional spirals, to the urge to explain yourself when silence would serve you better. This internal discipline is what sustains the external effect. Without it, the posture collapses under pressure. As this becomes integrated, your sense of self stabilizes further. You are no longer scanning environments for validation or threat. You are grounded, calm, observant. This calm is not passive, it is watchful. You notice shifts in tone, changes in behavior, subtle attempts to probe or provoke. You register them without responding immediately. Time becomes your ally. Most people reveal their intentions when allowed enough silence. This is where Machiavellian realism and Stoic control converge. You are not cold for the sake of coldness. You are restrained for the sake of sovereignty. Sovereignty over your reactions, sovereignty over your energy, sovereignty over your internal state. When sovereignty is established, self-love no longer needs reinforcement. It is implied by behavior. Eventually, you realize that being unreachable is not about keeping everyone out. It is about choosing who gets in and under what conditions. Selective openness replaces indiscriminate availability. When you do open up, it is intentional and rare. This rarity makes it meaningful rather than draining. You are not emotionally closed, you are emotionally precise. Most men never reach this stage because it requires letting go of the comfort of emotional exposure. Exposure feels honest, but it is often compulsive. Precision feels distant, but it is controlled. The man who masters precision can engage deeply without losing himself. He can be present without being penetrable. He can connect without being consumed. At this level, self-love becomes self-containment. You carry yourself differently. You move through environments without seeking to be seen or understood. And paradoxically, this makes you more noticeable. People sense the absence of need, the absence of noise, the absence of emotional leakage. Absence creates contrast, and contrast creates presence. You are no longer trying to be unbreakable. You are simply no longer reachable where you once were fragile. And because nothing valuable is exposed without intention, nothing essential can be taken from you. Part 6. The internal hierarchy. At this point, something fundamental reorganizes inside you. An internal hierarchy forms, not of emotions competing for control, but of principles governing behavior. Most men live without this hierarchy. Their decisions are reactive, driven by whichever impulse is loudest in the moment: fear, desire, pride, insecurity, comfort. When impulses rule, life becomes chaotic. even if it looks stable on the surface. Machiavellian realism demands hierarchy because power requires order. A state without hierarchy collapses. So does a man. Unbreakable self-love emerges when you establish a clear chain of command inside yourself, where principles sit above emotions, long-term leverage sits above short-term relief, and identity sits above momentary gratification. This internal hierarchy begins with a brutal demotion. Emotions are no longer allowed to vote. They may speak, they may inform, but they do not decide. Dark psychology makes this clear. Emotions evolved to help us survive immediate threats, not to navigate complex modern environments. When you allow emotions to dictate strategy, you optimize for comfort, not advantage. You choose relief over results. You soothe instead of structure. The disciplined man does the opposite. He feels fully, but he decides impersonally. This is not coldness, it is clarity. Clarity requires distance, and distance requires hierarchy. As this structure settles, you notice that certain behaviors fall away without effort. Over-explaining becomes unnecessary because explanation was never about clarity. It was about anxiety. Chasing disappears because chasing was never about desire, it was about insecurity. People-pleasing dissolves because it was never about kindness, it was about fear of rejection. When hierarchy is internalized, these behaviors lose their fuel. They no longer serve the chain of command. You don't fight them, you outgrow them. Stoic masculinity emphasized this long before psychology gave it language. The Stoics trained themselves to separate what they could control from what they could not, but they went further than most modern interpretations. They did not merely accept reality, they organized themselves to function optimally within it. They did not ask how to feel better, they asked how to act correctly. Correctness here does not mean morality as taught by society. It means alignment with reason and purpose. When your internal hierarchy is clear, you do not debate every decision emotionally. You execute based on structure. This is where self-love stops being emotional reassurance and becomes operational stability. You trust yourself not because you always feel confident, but because you know you will not betray your own standards under pressure. Trust in yourself comes from consistency, not self-talk. Each time you act in accordance with your hierarchy, you reinforce that trust. Each time you violate it, you weaken it. This is why unbreakable self-love is built through behavior, not affirmation. The internal hierarchy also changes how you experience temptation. Temptation loses its urgency because it no longer feels like an opportunity. It feels like a test. Tests are evaluated, not rushed. You become slower to react, not because you hesitate, but because you assess. Speed without assessment is impulsivity. Deliberate slowness is control. People often misinterpret this slowness as indecision. It is not. It is strategic patience. As this becomes ingrained, you begin to sense when others lack internal hierarchy. You see it in their inconsistency, their emotional volatility, their shifting values. One day they demand respect, the next they tolerate disrespect. One moment they assert boundaries, the next they abandon them. This inconsistency creates noise. Noise creates weakness. You are no longer drawn into that noise because your hierarchy filters it out. You don't need to correct them. You simply remain structured. Structure exposes chaos without confrontation. Machiavellian thought places immense value on internal order because it precedes external influence. A man who cannot govern himself cannot govern outcomes. He will be ruled by moods, by pressure, by incentives designed by others. When your internal hierarchy is solid, incentives lose their grip. You cannot be bribed with attention. You cannot be threatened with exclusion. You cannot be rushed by urgency that does not align with your priorities. This is not stubbornness, it is sovereignty. The hierarchy also clarifies ambition. You stop wanting everything. You start wanting what aligns. Ambition becomes selective. Focus sharpens. Energy consolidates. Instead of scattering effort across multiple directions to feel productive, you commit deeply to fewer pursuits. Depth replaces breadth. This is where momentum begins to compound. The world rewards depth because depth produces results that cannot be faked. Surface-level effort creates noise. Depth creates impact. Emotionally, this stage feels quieter, not empty, ordered. The internal debates that once drained you lose relevance. You are no longer negotiating with yourself every day about who you are allowed to be. That decision has already been made. This reduces friction. Reduced friction increases output. Increased output reinforces identity. Identity strengthens hierarchy. The cycle feeds itself. Dark psychology highlights another effect here. People test hierarchy instinctively. They probe for reactions, concessions, inconsistencies. When they find none, they adjust. Some become respectful, some become resentful. Both responses confirm the hierarchy's presence. Respect comes from clarity. Resentment comes from loss of influence. Neither should concern you. Your internal order is not built for external approval. This internal hierarchy also reshapes how you experience loneliness. Loneliness used to feel like absence of people, validation, stimulation. Now it feels like space. Space is not lack, it is capacity. You are no longer filling silence to escape discomfort. You are using it to think, to plan, to refine. Solitude becomes functional rather than painful. This is a major shift. Most men avoid solitude because it exposes internal chaos. When chaos is replaced with order, solitude becomes a tool. Over time, you realize that unbreakable self-love does not make you rigid, it makes you adaptable without losing form. Like a well-built structure, you can absorb stress without collapsing because the load is distributed correctly. Emotions still arise. Pressure still exists. Conflict still happens. But nothing hits you directly anymore. Everything passes through the hierarchy first. This is also where self-respect stabilizes. You no longer need to remind yourself of your worth. Worth is embedded in your decision-making process. You do not tolerate what undermines you. You do not pursue what compromises you. You do not explain what does not require explanation. This consistency creates an internal baseline that does not fluctuate with circumstance. Most men never build this internal hierarchy because it requires sacrificing emotional convenience. It requires saying no when yes would feel easier. It requires silence when explanation would soothe anxiety. It requires patience when reaction would feel satisfying. But once built, it frees you from constant self-monitoring. You are no longer checking whether you acted right. You know you did because you followed structure. As this hierarchy becomes second nature, you move through the world differently. You are not aggressive. You are not submissive. You are positioned. You occupy space without apology and without display. You engage when it serves alignment. You disengage when it does not. This neutrality is powerful because it cannot be easily categorized. People cannot predict you through emotion, and they cannot pressure you through urgency. This is the final transition before self-love becomes fully unbreakable. Not because nothing can challenge you, but because challenges no longer destabilize your internal order. You have replaced emotional democracy with principled command. And a man who commands himself does not need to defend his worth. His behavior already enforces it. From here, the transformation is no longer internal struggle. It is maintenance. And maintenance, quietly executed, is the highest form of power. Number 7. The absence of need. There comes a point where self-love completes a critical transformation. Need disappears. Not desire, not ambition, not hunger for growth. Need. And when need leaves, something rare takes its place: psychological independence. This is the stage where most external influence loses traction because influence feeds on lack. Every system of control relies on identifying what you cannot tolerate losing: approval, attention, comfort, certainty, belonging. When you remove need, you remove the hooks. You are still human, still social, still driven, but no longer dependent. Dependency is the quiet agreement to be shaped. Independence is the refusal to be bent. Most men misunderstand need. They think it is emotional vulnerability or openness. It is not. Need is the internal belief that something outside of you is required for you to remain whole. When that belief exists, your behavior reorganizes around protecting access to that thing. You compromise standards to avoid losing it. You rationalize disrespect to keep it. You silence instincts to preserve it. Need turns negotiation into submission without announcing itself. Machiavellian realism identifies need as the root of manipulation. Whoever knows what you need can control the terms under which you operate. The absence of need does not make you cold, it makes you neutral. Neutrality is powerful because it cannot be coerced. When you do not need to be liked, rejection loses its threat. When you do not need validation, silence loses its sting. When you do not need to be understood, misinterpretation loses its leverage. You begin to see how much of your previous behavior was driven not by intention, but by avoidance. Avoidance of discomfort, exclusion, uncertainty. When need dissolves, avoidance dissolves with it. You stop moving away from discomfort and start moving toward alignment. This stage often feels anticlimactic from the outside. There is no dramatic shift in personality, no announcement, no performance. Internally, however, the difference is seismic. You are no longer scanning interactions for reassurance. You are no longer measuring yourself against reactions. You are no longer calibrating your behavior to maintain emotional supply. You act, and you let outcomes occur without clinging to them. This detachment does not make you passive, it makes you precise. You are engaged without being invested in approval. Dark psychology explains why this unsettles people. Most social dynamics are built on mutual need, mutual reassurance, mutual validation, mutual emotional exchange. When one party exits that economy, the balance shifts. People feel it immediately. Conversations change tone. Expectations soften. Probing increases at first, as others attempt to locate your attachment points. When they find none, behavior adjusts. Some become more respectful. Others withdraw. Both outcomes are information. Neither requires reaction. The absence of need also changes how you experience success and failure. Success no longer inflates you because it does not complete you. Failure no longer devastates you because it does not define you. Both become temporary states within a larger trajectory. You are no longer emotionally leveraged by outcomes, you are informed by them. This allows you to take risks with clarity rather than desperation. Desperation is always visible, even when disguised as confidence. Clarity is quieter and far more effective. At this stage, self-love stops seeking affirmation even internally. You are no longer reassuring yourself that you are enough. Enough for what? The question dissolves. You are sufficient because you are aligned. Alignment replaces comparison. Comparison only exists when identity is externally referenced. When identity is internal, comparison loses relevance. Other people's success does not threaten you. Other people's opinions do not anchor you. Other people's pace does not rush you. You operate on your own internal timing. Stoic masculinity viewed this as freedom. Not freedom from responsibility, but freedom from compulsion. Compulsion is acting to escape discomfort rather than to pursue purpose. When need disappears, compulsion fades. You can sit with tension without resolving it immediately. You can delay gratification without resentment. You can endure silence without filling it. This endurance is not suffering, it is strength. It is the ability to remain intact under pressure. This is also where many relationships are redefined. Some dissolve naturally, not through conflict, but through misalignment. Relationships built on mutual need struggle when one party outgrows dependency. Others deepen Because they are no longer fueled by insecurity, but by choice. Choice-based connection is cleaner, lighter, and more respectful. You are with people because you want to be, not because you need to be. That distinction changes everything. The absence of need also sharpens perception. You begin to see need clearly in others, not with judgment, but with awareness. You notice how often people seek reassurance through humor, through dominance, through victimhood, through constant communication. You recognize these patterns without being pulled into them. This awareness allows you to navigate interactions strategically rather than emotionally. You respond to substance, not noise. Machiavellian strategy becomes effortless here. You are no longer thinking about power. You are simply not giving it away. Power is rarely seized. It is usually surrendered through need. When you stop surrendering it, your position stabilizes automatically. You do not have to assert dominance. You do not have to demand respect. You do not have to perform confidence. Your lack of need does the work for you. Internally, something else happens. Fear loses its edge. Fear relies on imagined loss. When you are not attached to outcomes for validation or worth, fear has less material to work with. You still assess risk. You still recognize danger. But fear no longer hijacks decision-making. It becomes a signal, not a driver. You move forward, even when uncertain, because uncertainty no longer threatens your identity. This stage also exposes how rare independence truly is. Many people speak of self-love, but very few are willing to release the emotional dependencies that undermine it. They want confidence without solitude, strength without discomfort, self-respect without boundaries. The absence of need requires all three. It requires solitude to hear your own internal standards clearly. It requires discomfort to dissolve old attachments. It requires boundaries to protect the new structure. As need dissolves, time becomes expansive. You are no longer rushing to prove anything. You are no longer reacting to perceived slights. You are no longer entangled in unnecessary emotional labor. Energy once spent on managing impressions is redirected toward execution. This is where long-term projects gain momentum. Focus deepens. Distractions lose appeal. You begin to value progress over attention. There is also a quiet humility that emerges here, not false modesty, but realism. You see yourself clearly, strengths, limitations, tendencies, without distortion. Self-love without need does not inflate ego. It stabilizes it. You do not overestimate yourself to feel secure. You do not underestimate yourself to stay acceptable. You see what is, and you work with it. This realism is grounding. It prevents both arrogance and self-doubt. The absence of need does not make you isolated. It makes you selective. You engage with depth rather than breadth. You listen more than you speak. You choose your moments. You are no longer available for every emotional exchange. Availability becomes intentional rather than automatic. This intentionality preserves energy and sharpens presence. Over time, this state becomes default. You no longer think about being independent. You simply are. Situations that once triggered anxiety now barely register. Interactions that once felt charged now feel neutral. You move through environments with a calm alertness. You are not closed, you are contained. Containment is strength that does not leak. This is the stage where self-love becomes invisible. There is nothing to show, nothing to prove, nothing to defend. You are internally complete, not because life is perfect, but because your sense of self is no longer outsourced. You do not collapse when things go wrong, and you do not lose yourself when things go right. You remain centered. When need disappears, manipulation fails, pressure fails, guilt fails, urgency fails. You cannot be rushed into decisions that violate alignment. You cannot be pulled into dynamics that drain you. You cannot be baited into reactions that reduce leverage. This does not make you invulnerable, but it makes you resilient in a way that is difficult to disrupt. Self-love at this level is not emotional warmth or constant positivity. It is internal completeness. It is the knowledge that whatever happens, you remain intact. And when a man reaches that point, the world changes its posture toward him. Not because he demands it, but because there is nothing left to exploit.